Women's roles changed significantly in World War II America. Many were conscripted to join the war effort on the home front and wielded unprecedented power through jobs outside the home. But their influence wasn't limited to the factory floor. Some women used their new social and political positions to fight back against isolationism and to sound the alarm about the plight of European Jews. A few of them even put their lives on the line to organize acts of rescue. In honor of Women's History Month, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum recently explored the role of everyday women during the World War II era, as well as the mindset and motivations of a few extraordinary individuals who dare to act. And joining us now to talk about all that are Gretchen Skidmore, Director of Education Initiatives for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Denise Kiernan, writer and producer and New York Times bestselling author of The Girls of Atomic City, the untold story of the women who helped win World War II. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
So Gretchen, let me start with you. What made the entry of women into the workforce during World War II so unprecedented? Was it the number of women who entered the workforce, or was it the jobs they were doing?
I think it's a combination. I think it's really a remarkable period when we see that women who were in very traditional roles going into this era were expected and willing to step up and do things that maybe they had never tried before, that broke the mold in a lot of cases, sometimes not even knowing what they were getting into. But it actually allowed for all of society to recognize the value that women were bringing to the workforce. One of the things we talk about is in 1936, if you polled Americans, 82% of them would have said that women should not work outside of the home if their husbands could. By 1942, only 13% said that. Yep. So they were very much a welcome asset for the country during this time.
Absolutely. It was such a transformative moment, really, in the history of women in the workforce, World War II was. And, you know, you talk about those opinions changing. So including just a variety of jobs that
Tell us
they
about it, because you think of Rosie the Riveter, right?
You think absolutely. There were seamstresses being put to work to make uniforms. There were people like the WASPs, the Women's Air Force service pilots, who were flying bombers across country and delivering them to male pilots. There were people of the Manhattan Project, scientists, chemists, women enriching uranium. And when we talk about what the expectations of women were prior to this, to keep a good home, to be a good wife, to raise the children, this sort of attitude towards women during World War II became so much about not what we expect from you, but what we value in you, what you have to offer, what we need you.
So it wasn't just economic power. I mean, obviously, that led to other power.
Absolutely.
Well, and they could even take like a traditional role, like a lot of women had been in social work, right? That was a role that women had. But then they transformed that in working in relief agencies that were targeting assistance for Jews who were persecuted in Nazi-occupied Europe.
And you mentioned the WASP, and I should add, and this kind of surprised me, 350,000 women.
It's a lot of
became
350,000
put on the
military.
uniform.
That's right. That's right.
So let's talk about that power that they accumulated during World War II. What happened to that power when the war was over and the men returned to the jobs? Was it greatly dissipated? What did they lose, and what were they able to keep?
One of the things we look at is the return of the veterans, right? And those jobs, there were 13 million who came home even as late as 1947. 8 million of them were registering for unemployment. So there was a need to make space for the veterans. There was also just a sense that to get things back to normal, that the women would, in most cases, leave those roles. There was a poll in 1944, over 80% of Americans said that even though women had served during the war, that those jobs, they should be fired from those jobs once the war was over.
Wow.
So, yeah, and what was interesting, kind of a twist on that in the Manhattan Project, where my focus is these jobs did not exist prior to World War II. So a lot of the women in the jobs that the women I interviewed, they were not taking over a job from a man who was away fighting. So it was always their job. And then when the war was over and men came back, veterans came back, these women had already been trained, highly trained, to do very specific work. And asking them to step aside would just require retraining an entire workforce. So what I found interesting as kind of a contrast is within some of these areas of the Manhattan Project, women had the ability, and some of the ones I talked to exercised that option to keep working because they enjoyed how it enriched their lives.
So listen, in the introduction, I said that some women use their new social and political positions to fight back against isolationism and to sound the alarm about the plight of European Jews. To what extent was there an ignorance still during World War II about the plight of the European Jews, and specifically Eleanor Roosevelt's role in educating her husband and the country about it?
Well, it's very interesting. I think a lot of people have the assumption that we didn't know anything, but there was actually widespread coverage across the media. The research that we've done at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum as part of this exhibition development has really uncovered coverage in all different levels throughout this period. So then the question is, given that information, how did people respond? And someone like Eleanor Roosevelt, certainly with her position, she had a column that she put out. She raised people's awareness of the plight of refugees and, in fact, took action. She endorsed legislation that would have brought refugee children, called the Wagner-Rogers Bill in 1939. And she also was a chairwoman of a committee that was meant to rescue children from Southern Europe. So she stood out and was a humanitarian and sort of the voice on that for the.
So she was clearly one of the heroines of the women heroines of the period.
Yeah.
Who were some of the other heroines?
Well, you have Edith Rogers, who was a congresswoman who co-sponsored that legislation that would have brought children to the United States outside of our restrictive immigration quotas. That did not pass, but she was one of the first to really say, we need to pay attention to the Nazi racial policies. It's a threat to people, particularly after Kristallnacht, where there was so much violence.
Denise, so what's the lesson that we can learn today, women and men, from the examples that these women set for us back then?
So much of what inspired my investigation of this time period and the roles that women played in it was so often when we look at these moments in history, we examine them from such a top-down perspective. We focus on who was making all the decisions, who held all the cards, who knew everything. And so many of these moments, the average everyday American man or woman really plays such an important part, whether or not their name is ever in a history book. I think that when we talk about these moments in history, and history's happening right now, we need to make sure to examine these moments from as many different perspectives as possible. And it's not, in a way, it's not really about women's history as much as it is about complete history. And really valuing those stories and, getting out there and, getting those oral histories and just valuing everybody's contribution.
All right. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I could go on forever. This has been such an interesting conversation. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Greta.
Thank you so much.